this is a badly drafted piece of law. The UN's leading human rights expert, they believe that what we're seeing here in the UK is a misuse of terrorism legislation whose effects are actually very, very broad, and as we've seen, far broader just than those individuals who were directly involved in the direct action, but actually now spreading to having a kind of deadening effect on people's ability to speak up about a government decision. I think if you were to say, is it paying off politically? I wouldn't ever believe that was a justification. Obviously, I'm from Amnesty. Of course I wouldn't. But I'm not even sure it's doing that. Not only do I think that we have people in government who know better, and they really do, we have principles that they say the UK wants to lead on that we clearly aren't in the way that we could. And I'm not even sure it's working for them politically. I think history is going to look back very, very poorly on this period since 7th October 2023 from the UK government for those reasons. And it may even be that international law and international legal institutions end up looking back with more action too for the reasons that I outline.
Sacha Deshmukh, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Thank you very much for having me.
For anyone who isn't familiar with your work, how would you like to introduce yourself?
So I work for Amnesty International, which is a global human rights organisation working all around the world. I work on human rights issues around the world, but I'm based here in London running Amnesty in the UK.
Most recently, Amnesty in the UK have issued an urgent action. Would you mind just telling us a brief overview of what that is?
Sure. So Amnesty, we issue what we call an urgent action when we think there's a serious human rights situation anywhere around the world. We have many of these that we're calling for around the world at any time. But what we're saying is we want people who care about human rights, obviously many of whom are Amnesty supporters around the world, to all take action together, to communicate to the government in question that there's a serious human rights issue, people have noticed it, and they don't think that situation's right. So sometimes that can be about a particular individual who's been arrested, say, or disappeared, calling out, we think there's a human rights violation. In other cases, such as in Hungary recently, it can be to do with government cracking down on freedom of expression. In that case, as I know you've talked about before, that was to do with Pride very recently in Hungary. And then most recently, and what we're here talking about today, we are very worried that the government here in the UK is absolutely not respecting people's rights to freedom of expression around peaceful protest. And that's what this urgent action is about right now.
On your website, a lot of you've just mentioned in a brief sense, a couple of them there, but there are urgent actions such as like disappearances of journalists or political activists in Saudi Arabia, Pride in Hungary. To a British audience, it must seem quite odd to have a policy of the British government held in the same situation as those urgent actions. Why do you think it's important to have them lined up next to each other almost?
Yeah, do you know, as a British person myself, I find it kind of surprising and not surprising in a good way when there's something this significant happening here in the UK. And actually, for people who don't know, Amnesty is a British organisation by origin. We were founded here in the UK in the 1960s. We work all around the world, but our global HQ is still in London. So, you know, for years and years and years, we haven't necessarily felt that there was such a significant human rights situation as we think now in relation to freedom of expression here in the UK. What's definitely the case now is that we're seeing things that we have seen in similar ways around the world. This is not the first time that we've seen a government around the world try and crack down on peaceful protests in ways that we're seeing most recently now in the UK. And we're also not the only global human rights experts to be saying, hang on a minute, now in 2025, there's a really significant issue in the UK. It's an issue around what we believe is excessive legislation in the UK that defines terrorism in ways that are not justified and are excessive. And we're not the only people to say that. The UN, for example, says the same things. And then that has a significant impact, not least of all then an impact as we're seeing right now, on whether or not in this country there is true respect for freedom of expression, respect for peaceful protest, which is one of the fundamental aspects of universal human rights. And it's actually one that our government says it should respect and makes a big play about whether or not other governments around the world are respecting. So we're seeing a real gap between our government's rhetoric, what it's saying it expects of other governments around the world, and then what we're seeing here in the UK. And if anyone is feeling that's surprising or alarming, there are a lot of people in this country who I think are thinking exactly that. That's not what they expected to be happening here in the UK right now.
The incident that is referenced in the urgent action is 700 arrests at a pro-Palestine Action protest in Parliament Square a couple of weeks ago. Out of kind of incursions or kind of statements of like displays of police intervention at protests in the past, whether it was the Conservatives being in government or Labour being in government, why is it that the event at Parliament Square a couple of weeks ago was the trigger point to issue this urgent action?
Well, the event that we saw at Parliament Square, but not only at Parliament Square a few weeks ago, we've actually seen around the country are a lot of people who are saying they do not agree that they should not be able to comment on a government's decision and that they should be held back from doing that, and wanting to speak out about that. And obviously what we saw in Parliament Square, but we've seen in other places, are protesters of all sorts of different backgrounds, but, you know, up to and including people who are very elderly, but feel very strongly that being able to speak up about a decision that your government has made is a fundamental right in this country. What we've seen, I think it's really important to be clear on this, is people who don't necessarily themselves like or agree with Palestine Action's tactics, but are now saying, even if you don't agree with those tactics, even if you didn't like them, they're questioning a decision as to whether it's right that our government has labelled those as terrorist actions when, for example, someone such as the United Nations' own lead on human rights has said, no, actually, he doesn't believe that that was an appropriate label for those groups to have. Even this discussion that we're having here, I would be advising you and making sure that we're really clear that we're discussing this in a way that couldn't inadvertently be targeted in and of itself as somehow allegedly supporting an organisation or supporting its actions. The reason I'd be doing that is saying, actually, I think it's important that there is public debate, and I think it's important that shows like this exist. Did I ever think that I would be in the position where I'd be having to think about so carefully here in a broadcast studio in London, talking to someone here in London, how we discuss what I think is a genuine question of public policy and a decision by our government? So I think you're absolutely right. Those peaceful protests in Parliament Square or others that we saw recently were a catalyst to this action. But what's the fundamental question that we're asking about here? Should people in this country be able to peacefully protest and ask questions about a decision taken by their democratically elected government? Because that is one of the fundamental tenets of universal human rights recognised around the world, and indeed something that our own government says and other governments need to respect. It criticises them when they don't. And yet we're in a situation here where, as we've seen people, some in their 80s, people of all sorts of different backgrounds, standing, holding a poster up with their point of view about a government decision and being arrested and charged under terrorism laws for doing that. So many people now are saying they don't feel that is right, and indeed is even undermining the UK's reputation, undermining the UK's position on human rights and on international law globally. Is it even having the effect that government wanted? That's an open question. But in a way, our ability to discuss that question is limited as well. The situation is almost Kafkaesque.
With some of the displays that you saw in Parliament Square then, there were also, in the aftermath of that particular protest, some instances of protesters being arrested with wearing T-shirts or having signs that didn't necessarily say the words Palestine Action on them, but alluded to Palestine Action and alluded to support for Palestine and support for action on what is happening in Palestine. What do you think it says about the British government's attitude towards what's happening there, when the policing of semantics almost of a decision seems to be more important than public perception of how Britain is seen to be acting in that space?
It's a really good question. I think it says a few things. One is it says what people have been saying right the way back to the early 2000s, when the Terrorism Act was drafted and put into law, and lots of people, Amnesty included, but many, many more, said this is a badly drafted piece of law. It's very ambiguous. It's very sweeping. It's very vague in a lot of things it says. And people have been saying for 20 years or so, what this can mean and what this will mean when it's enforced in certain situations is that there's a mixture of massive flexibility for government to interpret things in ways it wants, but even such ambiguity that, even a police officer can get confused in what they're meant to do. And I don't want to be here sort of demonizing every police officer. If you've got a badly drafted piece of legislation that's vague, you are going to end up with some police officers confused in what they're doing. So lots of people have been saying that. It definitely means that. A second thing that I think it does mean, and I think a lot of us are feeling, is there are some very big questions, very, very big questions about the UK's support for, or at least lack of the action that it should be taking for, an ongoing genocide that we're seeing in Gaza, and a deepening situation of apartheid that we're seeing in the West Bank and indeed in Israel itself in many ways. And that should be a genuine and deep matter of public debate. And for a government to perhaps be attempting to use this question as a distraction from that, a lot of people are feeling that that is something that you wouldn't see on another question of policy, and that perhaps that was the aim of government when it was looking at certain actions in relation to this. Now, one thing I perhaps would say is, if that was a government's aim, maybe it's backfiring, because having pulled a lever so significant, essentially saying we're going to crack down massively on freedom of expression, crack down even on people saying, I don't particularly like the tactics of that organisation, but I think they might be raising a legitimate question. I'm going to do that by grabbing this big lever, which is labelling you as a terrorist, if you're even thinking or articulating that. That has, I think, created a backlash to this decision. It's probably actually meant that there are many people going, well, hang on a minute, why would government feel it needs to do that at that kind of level? Is it actually that it wants to try and detract from that debate? But I suppose the one thing I would really urge all of us to remember is, while these debates are happening, and they are critical, and we are talking about critical rights of freedom of expression here, we're not talking about them because there's an abstraction somewhere else. There is an ongoing genocide and there is a deepening situation of apartheid, the latter part of which I saw very recently when I visited the West Bank. Obviously, I'm not allowed to visit Gaza, as not even yourself. Journalists aren't allowed to visit Gaza. But we're seeing the evidence of it regardless. Let's not allow any of us to allow anything to be a distraction from the fact that that is a completely appalling and unacceptable situation that's happening right in front of our eyes right now. And I don't think our government is taking the action that it should or could in relation to it.
Calling freelancers, small and mid-sized business owners. Tide's Instant Saver account offers up to 4% AER variable, flexible access and competitive returns.
Unlike other options on the market, you won't need to hold your money with Tide for a fixed period. That means you'll have instant access and free withdrawals whenever you need it.
You can get started today with just £1, making it easy to start growing your business savings.
Want to know what you'll earn? Tide's clever calculator gives you a clear picture up front.
Our audience will receive £100 cash back when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE, that's JOE, JOE. New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable, free for 6 months. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.
And with that, you've also got, I mean, in the days after the Parliament Square protests, you had Yvette Cooper coming out in defense of the government decision in the first place and in defense of the scenes that we're seeing there to say that, well, actually, we know things about this organization that the general public don't know. And I guess for a lot of people, it seems that it's a twofold position, right? It's we're not going to show you what our reasoning is. You need to trust us. Whether you want to protest or not is one thing, but whether you go against what our decision is and what is regarded as a terrorist organization or not is a different thing. And I wonder with the statement from Yvette Cooper, is that something that can kind of be taken for read, or is it like a defensive tactic? But also, it seems it's just ignoring the like what you've been talking about of like the public feeling and the strength of feeling, and it's kind of just doubling down and not really understanding where compassion lies in the British public at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds strange in one thing I'm about to say, but in some ways, what I would agree with the Home Secretary on is you don't have to like Palestine Action to be outraged about what's happening in Gaza and outraged about what's happening in the West Bank. And there are many, many, many people, many hundreds of thousands, millions of people in this country who may not have liked Palestine Action's tactics, may not have thought that they had any particular effectiveness or got across a point of view on what was happening in Palestine that they felt super strongly about. So on that, strangely enough, I would agree. What I am always skeptical about, because sadly I see it all around the world, is governments around the world who say, hey, trust me because I've got secret evidence, I've got secret knowledge. It is a pattern around the world, whether it's something to do with a crackdown on a particular organization for freedom of expression, or whether, and actually we've seen this within the conflict in Gaza as well, in some of the actions and alleged justifications from the state of Israel, where a supposition is thrown out. We're doing this because of this reason. We know what the evidence is. We're not going to share that. And actually, that's used as the justification for a human rights violation. We've seen the UN's leading human rights expert, who has considerable expertise and considerable ability to judge evidence all around the world, speak out very, very clearly that they believe that what we're seeing here in the UK is a misuse of terrorism legislation whose effects are actually very, very broad. And as we've seen, far broader just than those individuals who were directly involved in the direct action, but actually now spreading to having a kind of deadening effect on people's ability to speak up about a government decision. So it is real experts who are saying they think this is wrong. They have depth of knowledge. They have experience of similar situations around the world and governments trying to use similar tactics around the world. And so I think anyone who's perhaps hearing those justifications from the government, perhaps think about how the response from people who see this around the world should make you nervous of just giving your trust to governments and saying, I'm sure you know something that I don't.
Someone who's certainly no stranger to defending human rights, or certainly being on the side of the people whose human rights are being offended, is the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Given what we're talking about, how it pertains to the British state and its interaction with the people of Britain, but also Britain's kind of the political response to what's been happening since 2023. Like, top of the head, Israel has the right to cut off food and water. Israel is defending itself against terrorists. The war will end when the hostages are released. How does this contrast with the general, like, he comes from human rights stock, from legal stock. How does this his position now contrast with what we should be accustomed to by human rights experts and lawyers of the pedigree of Keir Starmer?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think maybe if I just start with some of the points of substance, because they're actually quite black and white. So we do have ample evidence, facts on the ground, clear demonstrations that what we have happening is a man-made famine in Gaza at the moment. And there is absolutely no justification under international humanitarian law for any country, even if you think there are military aims, for that to be a legitimate act in an act of war. There just isn't. That's just a fact. Very recently, you might remember there was another area of conflict in the Middle East, in Lebanon, a very intense conflict between October and January this year in southern Lebanon. And Amnesty just this week published evidence that showed that Israeli forces were demolishing large parts of civilian infrastructure, not just homes, but including mosques, including things as kind of critical as soccer pitches. And again, just a fact is, even if any of those facilities had been used by your military opponent, and even if there might be a risk that they might use them in the future, it is not justified under international law to then go, great, we can just level the ground on all of those because of that alleged in the future. The reason I say all of that is that those facts are not really facts and points of law of opinion that are vague. They're well established. They're well established. To your question, the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, and actually another critical figure in the government, the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, are genuinely, and their careers have shown, deep human rights experts. Keir Starmer has written textbooks that are the core basis of understanding large parts of international human rights law. There's no question that people at the top of government understand not just these as points of principle, but actually these as legal obligations on this country. And not just legal obligations on the country in the abstract, legal obligations that flow right the way through to the ministers who hold responsibility, and whether in some cases they could in future have been judged to be complicit or enabling some of these violations by dint of the knowledge they had and the actions they took or they didn't take. It's inconceivable that they don't understand that based on what they've written, on the work they've done, on the statements they've made, on the points of view that they've made. And actually, frankly, on something which many of us welcomed, which is that when the current government in the UK was elected, it said, we want the UK to be a leader in many of these areas of international law again and lead from the front, because they wanted to take pride in the fact that the UK played a role in actually creating these international frameworks, international structures. So what is the reason for the gap between that and some of what we're seeing? Honestly, it's hard to say, because I think if you were to say, is it paying off politically? I wouldn't ever believe that was a justification. Obviously, I'm from Amnesty. Of course I wouldn't. But I'm not even sure it's doing that. So typically when we see human rights not being respected by governments around the world, there is some alleged reason in realpolitik. I think that doesn't usually play through in the long term, but there's some kind of short-term reason, or maybe it's someone desperately trying to hold on to power. Here, not only do I think that we have people in government who know better, and they really do, we have principles that they say the UK wants to lead on that we clearly aren't in the way that we could. And I'm not even sure it's working for them politically. It's really hard to understand on what level this is delivering anything.
You said earlier on in the interview that you're just back from the West Bank. Just tell us what you found on the ground there.
So I went to visit the West Bank, occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem just earlier in the summer. And I thought when I went there that given how much I focus on what's happening around the world in human rights, all around the world, but obviously before I went there, knew more on paper than most people about the human rights situation there. I knew about the actual practices that we have seen. There's considerable evidence. They contravene the definitions of the Apartheid Convention, that we have a situation of apartheid there. I thought I would see that in reality, but I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be kind of taken aback. And I was wrong. seeing the situation on the ground, I was taken aback by two things: the depth and the impact of those policies and the speed by which it's getting worse. Even in a short visit, I could one day visit an area of the West Bank where there was a farm and a Palestinian farmer and a family that had been farming that territory for generations. The next day happened to go back and their land had been taken over, or their olive groves had been chopped down by illegal settlers, or between our two visits, they had been harassed and people had been attempting to make their lives impossible to live. Even in tiny periods in the same place, you could see the scale of what was happening, let alone actually in the weeks since I came back, where we've seen not just a deepening of rhetoric, but a deepening of attempts by the Israeli government, led by people within that government who have the strongest ties and the strongest representation of illegal settlers, to change the facts on the ground to such an extent that they believe that whatever world opinion might be in the future, even if there's a more emboldened world to act in the future, to try and deliver what governments have been saying for years about a Palestinian state, about respect for human rights, that it will be impossible to do so. But also while I was there, I should say that I was working with and speaking with Israeli human rights activists, many of whom have spoken out publicly and published their own evidence about the genocide in Gaza, many of whom are working day to day to try and hold back what's happening in terms of the apartheid we're seeing in the West Bank. But they're being tackled by the Israeli government as well. Those Israeli human rights organizations, activists, NGOs, part of what we're seeing, because those forces that want to see this apartheid deepen in the West Bank know that they would otherwise be a barrier to it, is an attempt to destroy and silence those human rights voices within Israel itself. It's a really, really alarming situation, and being honest, just far, far worse, and the acceleration of it far, far worse than I thought I would see, even though I went in thinking I knew it in great depth.
Amnesty have long described what's been happening in not just the West Bank, not just in Gaza, but in Israel as well, as an apartheid system. From afar, what it seems to me is, certainly since the end of 2023, there's been any drip of information that you get about the West Bank is this, as you mentioned, this ratcheting up of settlements, of depossession, of just general hard violence against the populations in the West Bank. And the only conclusion that I can seem to come to, or that seems to be logical to me anyway, is that one spectacle of human rights abuses is being used to cloak the spectacle of another set of human rights abuses. What does it seem like to you that these two things are happening simultaneously, but they're both being enacted by the same state, the same government?
In this particular conflict area, what I would say is I think we have seen clearly an absolutely deliberate attempt to restrict news. I do believe, yes, we've absolutely seen an attempt to restrict people's ability to see and understand what's happening in terms of apartheid in the West Bank. But that's not because we've seen an unrestricted attempt to let us know what's happening in Gaza. In fact, as many people have commented on, many of us know, including yourself, we've seen such alarming deaths of journalists in Gaza. We've seen the deliberate targeting, including most recently, obviously, some journalists from Al Jazeera, but far and away not the only time we've seen deliberate targeting of journalists, which has been described as deliberate targeting. Again, even if that alleged justification, of which there's some real questioning about whether or not there's even any facts to that were the case, in legal terms, that's not a justification for then just targeting a whole group of journalists. But we've seen it described as that. And even that, all of those killings, even the most recent ones I've talked about, have actually happened in a situation where international journalists are not being allowed in, which again is unusual compared to most conflict situations. So I think it is true that the world is struggling to pay attention and understand the depth of the violations that we're seeing and that they're happening in multiple places. Perhaps, therefore, what I'd say is don't think of these things as such unconnected things. Sadly, I think what we are seeing in multiple ways is some multiple human rights violations happening. I say to the world, whether it's in this situation, in this conflict area, but I'd also say this equally to things that are happening in other places in the world. Lots of us have a duty not to kind of go, I can only comprehend this one, I'm going to ignore that one. But in this case, don't forget, a lot of what organisations like Amnesty and others are saying are the kind of actions that we want, or the kind of actions that we feel perhaps the UK government has been weaker on, would be actions taken against the government of Israel because it is committing multiple human rights violations in multiple geographies. So in some ways, the actions that need to be taken to stand up and go, hey, this isn't right, can be caused by and can deal with multiple violations in multiple places. They don't have to be a pick and choose. In this particular case, we see such significant human rights violations, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, that many legal experts, myself included, would argue that either one of those areas would justify a stronger position being taken by the UK government towards the government of Israel that has responsibility for those actions in both of those areas. Certainly when both of the things are happening and you have one government, one set of ministers, one set of leadership there, you can't particularly see an argument for somehow that dividing or diluting our need to take action.
What do you think the lasting legacy of the UK government will be for all of those things?
Well, I'm going to answer that by saying a word that people might be surprised by me using if I was to say, what generally can you look back on a government, and any government, and say is one of the key qualities of a legacy that you can look back on proudly? And it's the reason I say it's a strange word is you might expect me to kind of use some really highfalutin word or some particular highfalutin concept. I'm going to say it's consistency. Because governments who act consistently, whether it's for friend or less friend, or whether it's for, what their supporters might demand versus the kind of person who is less of their supporter, when they act consistently and go, actually, whether it's domestically, we are the government of every citizen and every person who's in this country, or whether it's internationally and you say, well, actually, I expect myself to adhere to the standards that I expect of another country, and I don't just demand those standards when it's convenient for me. Actually, if I've got one of my friends, I kind of demand them too. Governments who act in that way can not only generally look proudly back on what they've done, but actually I would argue they're much more effective. It was the kind of entire rules-based order that built whatever kind of strength and progress that the world has seen over the last 70 or so years. Not perfect, but whatever progress there has been has generally been built on that. I think since 7th of October 2023, what is sad is that we haven't seen the UK government act, I believe, with the consistency and in the same way applying that consistency in relation to the parties in this conflict area and the mixture of human rights violations that have been committed by different parties. I'm the first to say that there have been different parties in this conflict area who committed human rights violations, but we haven't seen the UK government act with the consistency in relation to those and the consistency in the way it's worked with this situation that it may have done in another. And some ways, I think, and this will be less for me, this might be for the future, for history to judge, but even for organisations such as international courts to judge in the future, I think the lack of that consistency and the lack of adherence to international legal principles and principles that the government says it signed up to and should practice is of such a scale that in some cases actually a genuine question is being raised as to whether there's enablement either by inaction or even in some cases by action, the continued supporting of the exporting of some arms parts, for example, that means there's actual enablement of some of these actions, again, in a way that I do not think the government would have put up with or practiced or not found ways to act in other situations around the world. I think history is going to look back very, very poorly on this period since 7th October 2023 from the UK government for those reasons. And it may even be that international law and international legal institutions end up looking back with more action too for the reasons that I outline.
Thanks to Tide and their instant savings account for sponsoring this week's podcast.
New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable.
Our audience will receive £100 cash back when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.